Okay, first of all, this webinar it's intended to show some examples that people use when they are trying to build an import scenario. It is divided into two lessons. In lesson one, we will review some basic concepts. It's a short lesson because all these basic concepts will be used in the practical cases, which is the lesson two. So, without further waiting, I will continue with the slide. Can you see my screen also, please? Can you raise your hand if you can see my screen? Okay. Thank you. Okay. We will review this agenda. Okay. So again, this is lesson one. We have three parts of this. It's the use of the dialog answer lines, and also how to set up custom key fields, and the use of line number service command. We will use this line to add or delete some specific lines that we need to update into some records. In lesson two, we have the practical cases, which basically are the cases where most partners and customers and users are the ones that try to achieve. There are some examples like updating records, changing some classes, and we will use the functions from lesson one, and they will be applied into these practical cases from lesson two. So we will continue with the next slide. Okay, we have the basic concepts that we listed in the previous slide. First of all, we have the use of dialog answer lines. When you map the dialog answer line under the source field value of an import scenario, you commonly need to select the needed answer that you need depending on the screen. There are some pop-up screens that jump when you make some changes. For here we have an example. Under customer screens, if you change the customer class, the system asks you if you want to keep the current billing settings or update the ones with the new class. So depending on the class, as you can see, the class pulls some default values. So when we create an input scenario to change a customer class, like the example shown here, we will need to tell the system whether we need to update with a yes or a no. The same answers that we have here. You can see them listed under the dialog answer mapping. Here we have at the end yes and no. So depending on what we want, that is what we will use. This applies to other screens. So when you have any pop-up screen that asks you for a specific action, you can use this dialog answer in your import scenario mapping. Okay. The next one is the custom key fields. To specify the custom key fields, you need to define the key by using the add notation directly after assign the custom field to a value. On the mapping tab of the import scenarios, we need to select commit for this field to make the system update the form after this key is specified. Here we have an example where we will use this custom key field for inventory ID. In this case, we will use it for searching a specific line based on this inventory ID that we have in our data provider. We will see how it works and how it's used in the lesson 2 about all the common examples. Here's an example. According to the previous slide, we are using custom key field for inventory ID to let the system know which line we're going to maybe update. We can also delete them. So depending if we have the Lego piece set in our provider or the Skywalker trampoline, the system will look at this line and perform the actions that we needed to perform just before this custom key field was specified. Okay, also we will use the line number service command. When you map a field under a grid section, let's say for example document details tab, the system automatically adds this line because usually you add lines when you are creating like sales orders, invoices, and this line it's the same as clicking on this add row button, which is this plus that it's under blue. But we also can use this line number service command to delete the lines. If we map a line to equal -2, this one will need to manually specify this value. -1 usually it's automatically inserted by the system, but this -2 we need to manually create it. So this will be the same as the delete row button, which is this X that it's in a circle between red. So we can use either -1 or -2 depending on what we need. -1 will be added by the system, and the -2 will be the same as clicking on delete row. Okay, basically these are the first lesson. As I mentioned, it's a short one because all these functions we will see how they are used in the second lesson, which is the practical cases. So in the practical cases we will start, and I will go ahead and show the slides, and then I will go to my Acumatica instance so I can show you actually how it's working and the actual results of these practical cases that we will review here. First of all, does anyone have any quick questions about lesson 1, or can we proceed? Okay, no questions. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to start with lesson 2. Okay, the first example for these common examples that we will present for this webinar, it's to import records with multiple lines when you have auto-numbering enabled. When you have auto-numbering enabled, usually the users think that the system will assign all the next numbers according to the numbering sequence. But if we have multiple lines, we still need to map this field because it is a key field, and we need to let them the system know which lines belong to which document. So here's an example. When auto-numbering is enabled, the field that defines which lines from the data provider will be uploaded, it's mapped to the order number field. So here we have order number field. And below, here's how my data provider, in this case it's an Excel provider type, it's going to be mapped. Here we have order number column. What does this mean? The first 3 lines that have the same value, which is 1, will be uploaded into the same document, in this case sales orders. And the next 2 lines that have a different value, the system will look at these values and then create a new sales order after we change this value from 1 to 2. And the next sales order will have 2 lines under document details tab. To the next slide. Here's what the system looks at. It's the last numbering from the numbering sequence, and then it will automatically assign the next corresponding numbers depending on the values that we define under the field that we are mapping to order number. Okay, so here's the result when you import the sales orders. Here you have the first sales order. It's taking the next numbering from the numbering sequence, which is 4124, S0004124, and it contains 3 lines under document details, the ones that we specified with the value 1. And in the next sales order, we specify the value as number 2, and the both lines that have this value were uploaded into the same sales order. I will pull my Acumatica instance. I have my import scenario here so I can show you. Okay, so here is my instance. We have order number mapped to our order number column, which is the Excel file. Here it's the same that I've shown you in the slides. The order number, here we have 3 lines that have value number 1 and a couple of lines with number 2. So when we import this, so we run this import, we will get 2 sales orders, one with 3 lines under document details and the other one with 2 lines, which are the ones for value that have order number value number 2. Okay, so it's processed. You can see this the inventory IDs that we have. And if you go to sales orders, here's the first one that was created. Of course, the order number is different because the previous one was just in my example, but this is the one that it was created according to the ones that were mapped with number 1, and the next one with 2 lines under document details according to the values which have number 2, and that's how the system knows which lines will be uploaded. So remember, even if you have auto numbering enabled, you still need to have the order number line mapped. This also applies for invoices, for other documents like purchase orders. The first field where you define the numbering sequence, which is defined automatically, is the one that will be mapped to the corresponding lines that we have in our data provider. And this way, the system will know which lines will belong to which document. Okay, so I will go back to my presentation. Okay, here's another common thing that is used by the users who create input scenarios, which is update. This is pretty straightforward, but it's very commonly used. Sometimes you miss some values when you import your vendors, customers, maybe inventory items. So in this case, we need to update existing records. So what we will need to do to update an existing record, in this case, basically, you just need to imagine that you were manually doing the same. So what do you do if you need to go into a vendor and update a specific field? In this case, it's phone number 2, the one that is missing. So first of all, if you were manually doing this, you will go into vendor screen, type or search for the vendor ID. In this case, it's Arctac Networks. And once you populate this value on the vendor ID, all the values that are already populated with pulled, and you can update any value or any field that you need to update. So with an import scenario, this is exactly the same. We just need the first line, which is the most important line for the vendor ID in this example. So the record name, it's the one that you'll need to map first. And once you map it and the system searches for it and it exists, then you can update any field within the system, as long also if it's not grayed out. This is another very important thing when you create an import scenario. If there is something that you can perform manually, if there is a grayed out field, a disabled field, depending on the document status, you won't be able to do it also with an import scenario. So this is the very, very important to know. If you are able to manually update a field in a screen, you can do it with an import scenario. So in this case, first, we just need to pull the existing item, which will be our first line on the mapping. In this case, it's vendor ID. It's the one that we are mapping here. And below, once the record was pulled, we can map not just one. In this case, it's an example for phone number 2 for practical purposes, but you can map as many fields as you need to update, and just at the end you need to enter an action save command. This way the system will update the fields that you need to update. You can also update existing fields. If phone number 1, the value is not correct, you can override it and enter the correct value. So this way the system will update everything that you need to update, and then at the end it will save the record and all the changes will be saved. On to the next slide. Mass delete records, it's very similar to the previous one, which was mass update. But in this case, we will delete the record. Sometimes we do not like to have some customers that we no longer need, or some items. So we will map the corresponding inventory ID, which is the same example as was in the previous one, but this one is for stock items. And once the inventory ID is pulled, instead of action save, here's what changes. You need to select action delete, which is the same as clicking into this trash can button that deletes the record. Also following the same explanation as the previous slide, if you can manually delete a record, maybe this item it's being used in open transactions, and we have in stock, things that might cause an error, then we won't be able to do it. But if you are able to manually delete something, you will be able to do it with an import scenario. So I will go ahead and pull my Acumatica instance to show you these two examples. Searching for them. Okay, so first of all, we will update the vendors. So as you can see, it's the same in my slides. I have my vendor ID mapped, and then for the next line, I will update phone number 2. We will look for this the input by scenario. Here you can see the vendor ID and the phone number 2. So we just click on import. Record is processed. Then we go to vendor screen and look for this vendor arc tag. Now you can see the phone number 2 field was populated with the value that we specified in our data provider. Okay. Now I'm going to show you how mass deleting the records will be performed. Okay, so this is mass delete items scenario. You can see at the end, I do not have this action saved. In this case, we will delete the record. Okay, we will prepare this one. We have this item that this is the one that we want to delete. Give me a second. Inventory items. Okay. So you can see here, the stock item actually exists, and this is the one that we will delete. You can see this item here. We have to click on import to process this scenario. In this case, I just need to map the inventory ID because I'm not going to update any other field. I just need to pull the existing record and then just click on the trash can button, which is the delete button, and then the record will be deleted. So let's process the import scenario. System is already finished with this. So I will pull now the stock item screen. Remember, the item that we are going to delete is del item. If I search for it, it's no longer there. So that is how we can mass delete items. Remember, it is very important to note that the item or the record that you need to delete can be deleted. If you have some inventory in stock or open transactions, we will get some errors. So that is one of the basic and main rules when you create an import scenario, is that if you can perform the action manually, then you will be able to do it with an import scenario. Okay, so I will go back to my presentation. Any questions about this mass update and mass delete items? Okay. Okay, perfect. There are no questions. Also, if you have some questions that that came up to you during the session, and we can review it at the end, or you can also email it to me. That's fine, and I will review them and respond to everyone via email. So let's go back to the import scenario presentation. Okay, here's another commonly used example of an import scenario, and this applies for all screens that you can define a class. For example, customers, vendors, items. So in here we will show how to map an import scenario to update the records class. When you, as I mentioned in the first slides, this is where we will use the dialog answer. When you change the class, when classes are defined, it will automatically pull all the default settings for this class, like all the GL accounts that we are going to use and everything. So once we change class, the system prevents us, if we need to keep the previous settings from the previous class, or we need to update the record with the new class that will be specified under financial settings. So here's when we will use this dialog answer, which was one of the basic concepts that we reviewed in the lesson 1. So to map the lines to confirm updating current customer settings in this example with the new customer class, we need 2 lines for this. The first line that we need to include is the dialog answer that we reviewed in the previous slides. And depending on what we need to either keep the previous settings or the default settings for the previous class, or we don't, we can specify yes or no, depending on what we need. So, and then below, under general settings, this is where the new class or where the customer class is defined. we need to map the new class that is the one that we have in our data provider. So in this case, the first line will need to be mapped to the target object customer summary, and will be mapped in this example to yes. So we will update all the default settings with the settings from the new class, and then we will specify the new class. Usually when you create an import scenario, you need to follow the same order as if you were manually creating the record or any record that you need to update into the system. The same order usually needs to be followed. In this case, the dialog answer line needs to be mapped before. When you manually change a record, and I will pull my Acumatica instance and show you. It's receivable customers. Okay. So here we have a customer. The natural order when you manually do it here is I select first the class, and then we get this message from the system asking us if either we want or not. But when you map an import scenario, the dialog answer, which will respond to this question or to this warning, is going to be mapped first, and then the customer class, as it appears here. First we have dialog answer, and then below the customer class. Okay. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so here we have to process the scenario, and then the new customer class is updated. So I have also an import scenario here that we will use, so I can show you how this works. Okay, so here is my import scenario. As you can see, I mapped to customer summary. Well, first of all, I mapped it to the customer ID. It's the same concept as the mass update and mass delete. These are the key fields, and this is the one that we will need to specify to pull the customer that we need to update. Then we map the dialog answer to customer summary, and below, financial settings, customer class, where the customer class is located. And I have in my data provider the new class, which I will show you how it appears here under the input by scenario screen. Okay, so here you have the customer ID, which is the one that we will update, and the new class that we will specify. I will pull customer screen also here, so you can take a look at this customer and how it's set up. Here it is. Okay, so we have international customer class specified for this customer, which is C class, and we will change it to the key class, which is the new class, and we will also update all the existing values for it. So from international, we will change it to key customers. Okay, so we'll put this away for a little bit while we process the import scenario. Okay, record is processed. And here is the customer with the new customer class that we have in our import scenario, which is key customers. Also, this will pull all the GL accounts that are predefined for this class instead of the ones that we have. So this is a very common example that users try with import scenarios, which is update class, depending on how you need to update your classes and all your settings, depending on the change that you have during your business processes. So in this case, we updated already the customer class. Can you hear me fine? I just wanted to verify. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Looks like it's fine. Okay. I will continue with the next slide. With my next import scenario example. Okay, so here we'll import the vendor payment instructions. This is another scenario that is commonly used, and it's a little bit tricky. I will show you in the next slides what we need to do, because there are some fields that we need to look up that are not exactly under the vendor screen. When we need to enter a specific payment settings, a payment method that will open the payment instructions. This not apply for all payment methods. In this case, for example, FedWire, it's one of payment method that includes the payment instructions. So in order to import the payment vendor instructions, as I mentioned, we need to look at a different screen. Usually when you create an import scenario, all the fields that you will use belong to that screen. But in this case, these payment methods, we need to use the values specified on the payment method screen. Here we have FedWire payment method. And under settings for using AP, we have the payment method details, which are the ones that appear on the vendor screen. And here we will look at the IDs, which are not specified. If you go to the actual vendor screen, I will pull my Acumatica instance for this. I will look for a vendor that has this payment method. So let's say I want to create a new vendor. So look like this was already used. Any value, it's fine. Oh, wait. Sorry. First, the payment instructions. Okay, looks like the previous values were already used. Okay, so here on the payment settings, once we select a payment method that includes the payment instructions, this will appear. But as you can see, there is no ID, and this is the field or the value that we need to use for the import scenario. So in this case, as I showed you in my slides, if you go to the payment methods under cash management and look for payment method FedWire, under settings for using AP, you will see these values, which are the payment method detail IDs. So ID 1 through 4 correspond to beneficiary account number, beneficiary name, bank routing number, and bank name, which are the ones that we look here for the payment setting instructions. Okay. Once we look at these values, here's what we need to do. First of all, when we select the default payment settings, we select the corresponding payment method. And when this payment method is selected, these fields will be enabled, all the fields from payment instructions. So in this case, we will need to use the custom key field, as we reviewed in the basic concepts. The custom key field will be the detail ID, in this case 1 through 4, all the ones that we looked under cash accounts, under payment method screen, under cash management. And we will map first the value that corresponds to the first value, and then below we will map the values that for these fields to be populated. So in this case, we have detail ID number 1, which corresponds to beneficiary account, and then below the beneficiary account. Again, next one for detail ID, which is the ID value corresponds to number 2, and below it's the beneficiary name. You will see more in detail in the next slides how is this populated. And also an important thing that you need to do for this specific import scenario is to uncheck active for the line number line. This line number is automatically populated by the system. The system inserts this line as soon as we enter the value, the first value line. So we don't need to add new lines, which is what line number 1 mapped to equal -1. It's the same as adding a new line. But we don't need to add new lines because once we populate the payment method, these fields are automatically appear. So they don't need to be included like by clicking in the plus button or add row button. That is why we will need to deactivate this line number line. So here's the explanation. First of all, on checking active for line number line, as I mentioned, it's inserted by the system and it adds a new line, but we don't need to add a new line. Since we specified the corresponding payment method which opens these fields, then we don't need to add new ones. Just populate them. And this is why we are using the custom key for detail ID. What we are doing here is telling the system which of these payment instructions, which of these lines within payment instructions is the one that we are going to populate. So in this first example, in this first line, we are telling the system we need to populate the payment instructions which corresponds to the beneficiary account. And under the value field, we will actually have the value that will be populated for this one. And the same for the fields below. So I will show you in my next slide and it will be more illustrated. So here's the values that we will have to populate. First of all, of course, we need the vendor ID, which is the vendor that will be populated. And then we will populate the payment method, which will open all the fields on the payment instructions. And we have the actual values that we will insert into these fields. The beneficiary account number, beneficiary name, the routing number, and the bank name, which are the fields that appear under the payment instructions. Okay? And once you populate them, these are the values that you have. So again, even when we don't see the ID of these fields, this is what we will need to do. Specify this ID, and now the system knows, okay, the ID number 1 corresponds to beneficiary account. And what's the value that we need to populate here? Okay, the value that we have under the Excel spreadsheet, which in this case was 98765. The same for beneficiary name. The second line, where we specified the detailed ID as 2, the system now knows that the detail ID that corresponds to this value number 2, its beneficiary name. And then it will populate this value with the corresponding value that we have in our data provider. And the same for bank routing number and bank name, which are the detail IDs 3 and 4. Okay, I will pull my Acumatica instance now, and I will show you how this is working. Okay, we will look for the corresponding import scenario. Okay, you can see here, here's my custom key fields, detail ID to 1. The value that corresponds to this first detail ID, beneficiary account. The same for the detail IDs 2, 3, and 4. You will see also this is very similar to when you import attributes, which is another example that we will review in the next slides, where you need to first specify which one you need to select, and then the value that will be populated into this field. Okay, so I will pull this scenario. Instructions. You can see here my values that I have for my vendor that I will going to update, and all the values that we need under payment instructions. Okay. I will pull also the vendor screen so you can actually see how my vendor, how the values are appearing in my vendor. So it's vendor payment instructions. And these are the values that I actually have. And these values are incorrect, so I will need to update these values to correct values, which are the ones that I have in my data provider of my import scenario. Okay, so now we need just to import. Okay, it was processed correctly. And if we refresh the screen, go to payment settings, you will see now the new values that we have in our data provider and our input scenario are populated. This, when you are uploading vendors for the first time, this is very commonly used, and so usually this I recommend to update these vendors in a separate scenario, because they have different fields. When you have a payment method that opens these payment instructions that needs to be populated. So once you have updated all these vendors, you will have all these values populated depending on the payment method that you select. I will go back to my input scenario presentation. Okay, the next example it's also very useful and very commonly used, and is to update existing lines on a grid. In this scenario, I will use purchase order screen to update a specific line under the document details tab. In this case, the example is quantity. This will apply for other screens, but in this case, we will use the custom key field that we reviewed in lesson 1 to let the system know which line that's the one that we are going to update. In this case, let's say the quantity for this purchase order is not correct, and we need to update. If you have imported a lot of purchase orders and the quantities are not correct, and there are other fields that you need to update, you can do it with an import scenario, and you will must update all these fields. Using the add notation, which is creating a custom key field, it will be shown in the next slides, we will indicate the system the specific line that we need to update. So instead of adding a new line, we will just select the line and update the value that we need. Okay, here's the scenario mapping, how it will look like. So first of all, we need to select the custom key field. I'm using inventory ID, but other fields can be used. For example, the description of the line can be used to search for a specific line under document details, which is our target object here, and then select the corresponding line that we have for this inventory ID, and at the end, update the quantity with the new value. Okay, in this case, again, when we insert inventory ID field, the system automatically adds this line number, which is used to equal -1. It's to add a new line, but we do not want to add a new line. We just want to update an existing line. So in this case, we need these lines that be mapped, and the system will look at this inventory ID, and once it finds the inventory ID, it will go to order quantity and update the new order quantity. Okay, I have a question from Tim. So he's asking, when you use the inventory IDs to search for the PO line, what if the inventory ID is on multiple lines? Will it stop at the first line? Yes, Tim, that is correct. If we have multiple lines with the same value, we need to specify another key field, because in this case, the system will update the first one that it will. Let's say in line number 1, we have AC computer item. And then in line number 2, we have a mouse. And then in line 3, we have another AC computer. It will just update the first line. So we will need to either specify another field as a key field, the description, the quantity, other fields that we know that it's different. Otherwise, the system won't update all the lines, just the first one. Okay, thank you for your question, Jim. So I will continue with the presentation. Okay. You have the inventory ID. How do we know which is the value that we need to enter? Because in the screen you can see it's inventory ID with a space, but for the key field, that we will specify, we can find it under the native field action name column. You can see here there is no space. This is how it's stored in the system, and that is how we will indicate. So just before the native field name, in this case inventory ID without any space, we will specify the add notation and this will let the system know, in this example, based on the inventory ID, which line we will need to choose. Then, line number line, it's not active because, as I mentioned, this line number line is the same as clicking on the Add Row button. And in this case, we are not going to add new lines. We're going to just update existing lines. So here we will select the inventory ID, and based on this inventory ID, we will update the one that we need to specify for the new quantity. In this case, we are updating quantity. We'll go to my next slide to illustrate this. Here's the line number that I will explain in the previous slide. It's not active. And then at the end, we specify the new quantity. So think of it as if you were manually under the purchase order screen. So first of all, you select the line, highlight the line, which is what add inventory ID does. We don't need to add a new line. Line number is inactive. And when we find the inventory ID, we just go to the quantity and specify the new quantity that we need to update. So here's how the import scenario looks like when we prepare. This is again our Excel spreadsheet. Here we have the inventory ID. In this purchase order, we have two items, the Acer laptop computer and the Lego pset. And we will select this inventory ID. That is what we are doing with the add inventory ID notation. So the system knows that this line is the one that will be selected. And then the new order quantity will be specified into this field. Okay, so again, I will pull my instance and I will show you how the import scenario is processed. Okay, loading. Okay, perfect. Okay, first of all, we need to pull the existing record. This is an existing record, so we are updating the document details lines. So first of all, we specified the type, the purchase order type, and the order number, which are our key fields for this screen. And once we map these fields, the order number is pulled. And then we go to document details, select the add inventory ID. I think I forgot to mention this notation needs to be manually typed. If you go into the lookup for the existing fields for this target object, you won't find this add. It needs to be manually typed. So you can go here and just type the double add symbol, and then type, as I mentioned, the native field action name. This is the column where you can find it. Here it is, inventory ID. So just before the native field name, we have the add notation. On check active for line number 1. Again, we don't want to add a new line. We just want to update the existing one. Select the inventory ID line that we need to update and then save. So here is my purchase order. Again, I have my type, which is a normal type. and the new value that we need. So the existing order is PO 000647. I will also pull this order so you can see the, the actual and the result that we will have after processing this import scenario. Go to purchase orders. And here is my purchase order. Here it is. So here you see, I have two lines, the a comp 01 item and a Lego 500. And for the quantity, I have 10. So this is the field that I'm going to update. Instead of 10, you will go select this line manually, which is what the add notation does. Update this value, and then save. I'm not going to do it here because we are going to do it with the import scenario. But this is what the field that will be updated. Okay. So let's go back to my import scenario. You can see the new quantity is 7. It was 10 previously. So once I click on import, process, okay. And I will put the purchase order, and the order quantity was being updated based again on the inventory ID. This is how the system knew which line would need to be selected. Okay. So let's go back to my presentation. So far, any questions? Can you hear me fine? Can you see my screen? Just verifying. Raise your hand or write in chat if you can hear me and see my screen. Perfect. Okay. Thank you. I will go back to my presentation. Okay. Next scenario. Okay. The next scenario is how to delete a row from a grid. This example, we will use the add notation, the custom key field. So it will be similar to the previous one. First, we need to indicate the system the line that we need to delete. And we will use the line number being mapped to equal -2, which will be the same as delete row. Clicking on this X button. So here, the add row button is equal -1 when it's mapped to the line number, or in this case we will use the equal -2 to delete a specific record. And we will combine both the custom key field, first to select the record that will be deleted, and then the line number function that we reviewed in the previous concepts being mapped to -2 to delete the specific row. Okay. Next slide. Here is how the import scenario needs to be mapped. Okay. So first of all, as I mentioned, the custom key field, which in this case again is inventory ID, and then these two lines are similar, are exactly the same as the previous one, the custom key fields. But for these ones, instead of deactivating the line number, we will use this line and change the equal -1, sorry, which is the value that it's automatically inserted by the system, and we will change it to -2 to delete the line that we need to delete, and then we will have the record updated as required. Okay, so here's how the import scenario looks like. This is again my prepared grid, the values that I have in my data provider. Here we have the purchase order number and the inventory ID field, which is the one that we will need to delete. And then once you process the import scenario, you won't have this line. Then I will pull my Acumatica instance to show you how and process this import scenario. Okay, just verifying. Okay, good. So as you can see, it's very similar to the previous one. The only thing that we are changing is the line number because we are deleting the line, not updating the line. So here we have the inventory ID as a key field, the inventory ID, and then with the -2 being mapped to line number, the line will be deleted. So let's prepare the import scenario. Okay. This is my purchase order number and inventory ID field, which is LCOM2. And I will pull my purchase order screen so you can look at the actual screen and how this purchase order appears on the screen. Okay, so again, remember the line that we will delete, it's the one for LCOM2. That's the inventory ID. Here we have the lines, and this is the one that we need to delete, the last one, okay? So using the custom key field, we will select this line and delete it. I will also show you, I will delete a line here. So when you enter inventory ID, this line number, it's mapped to equal -1, which is the same as new. You can see here you don't have equal -1, but this equal -1 is the same as new on the drop-down. This is the field that it's available. So this is how it will look like when you add the inventory ID field. So here you just need to go and change the 1 for 2 and save it. And now we specified correctly to delete the desired row. So let's go to the import scenario and click on import to process the scenario. Remember, this is the line, the last line that we are going to delete, which is the last one, LCOM2 from purchase order 000648. Okay, now we click on import. Okay, it's processed. I left this one as it is, and we will refresh the screen. And you can see that the last line was deleted based on the inventory ID. So this is a very useful function, this equal -2 to delete rows. Again, I'm presenting some examples for these screens, but it applies for other screens as well, where you have some lines under a grid, let's say document detail lines. You can use the same logic, and you will select the line and delete it. And another important thing is to make sure that you are able to delete it. If we have if we are pulling an existing purchase order that it's already processed, then the action is not available. You won't be able, these fields will be grayed out. So the same applies for an import scenario. If you can manually perform an action in a screen, you won't be able to manually do it you won't be able to do it with an import scenario either. Okay. So let's go next into the next slide. Okay. Here's an example of the importance of mapping line orders. As I mentioned in the previous examples, it is important to follow the same order as if you were manually creating a record. When you manually create a record, you first populate the first lines, the first fields from the summary, then you go back and the general settings and other settings that you have for. So you need to follow the same order because there are some fields that are populated automatically or other fields that might error out, which is the example that I will show you in this exercise. It's if we get an error in an import scenario, it will break the import process. So in this case, I will create an import scenario and we will use this import scenario to import a new Canadian vendor with a postal code validation enabled. So the vendor class has a US default country. So we need to change this. I will show you in the next slides why is it important and why the import scenario needs to be mapped in a specific order. Okay. Go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we have a postal code validation set up for the US country. So this means if this is not matched, if we enter an incorrect value, we will get an error. Of course, if we are manually creating the record, we just can't change the error and input a correct value or change the country. So now the validation matches, and that's fine, and we can continue and save the record. But for the import scenario, when we get this error that I will show you, it will not continue. It will show you the error and stop the process. So it is important to follow the same order as if you were manually creating the record in the import scenario mapping lines. Okay? Okay, so here's the example. If we map the postal code field before the country, since the customer class defaults to US and the postal code validation is enabled for this country, we will get an error because the postal code for Canada has different values that are not valid for United States. So in this case, if we map first the postal code, we will get an error, and the system will let us know that this value code does not match the required expression because it's being mapped before the country. So think of it as if you were manually populating this field, you will get the error, and that will break the import process. As I mentioned, manually it won't, but when the import scenario process is being run, it will break this and you won't be able to continue processing the records. Instead, go to the next slide. Okay, if we map country field first and then the postal code, what will this do? I mentioned that the country, in this case, for this class, it's United States. So first, we change the default country, United States, to Canada, and then map the postal code. So now the import scenario, it's processed correctly, just by changing the order of these two lines. So the trick for this is to go to every time you create an import scenario, you go to the actual screen and you type in the same order of the mapping lines, you will manually type the values for these fields. So when you go into the postal code and populate it first, you will see the actual error, and it's not matching. And then you will see that you need to first update the country, and that is why I made this change under the import scenario mapping. So just by changing these two lines, the error no longer appears, because first we changed it to the country, and now the postal code is valid for Canada. Okay, so I will go into the system and show you how this works. Okay, okay. So let's say I will create a new vendor. So it's Canada vendor. I will populate all the fields. Okay. Class that we have here, it's G and A. Okay. So you can see here the country is United States. So if we enter, it's defaulted. So if we enter an invalid postal code, we will get an error. So we will first need to change it, okay, to the corresponding country, and then we will be able to enter the values that we need for this one. So let's go to the import scenario mapping. Okay, so I have this, and I have first country and then postal code. I will change the order of these lines just so you can get the error. Pull this here. Okay, so this is a vendor, and this is the postal code. You can see this value, it's not valid for the US country. So if we try to process, you will get the error, and the error is it's specific. So an error occurred because the postal code that we have specified here does not match the required expression. This is because we have enabled the validation for the US country. So if we try to first enter the postal code, it will error out. So instead, we change this and enter first the country. So now we specify that the country is Canada, and the postal code that we have specified for this one matches. So in this case, it will process the new vendor. Okay, it's processed, and if we go to the vendor screen, and look for this Canada PC for postal code, you will see we have the postal code populated because of the change we made for the country first and then the postal code. Okay? Any questions, any comments? Okay, perfect. Let's continue with the presentation. Okay, here it is. In the next example, the result, we will show how to import attributes. This is a very commonly used scenario also, and we will learn how to create an input scenario to upload the custom attributes. And also one of these attributes, it's a multi-select combo type, and we will select multiple attributes. For this type of attribute, you can select multiple values, so we will show it how it needs to be mapped in the import scenario. Okay, so you have, when I'm mapping attributes, we need to use the lines that are specified for the value ID. The first line will be mapped to the attribute ID, and the second line will populate the column that we need to populate. So in this case, this is a multi-select combo attribute. So in the first line, we will first indicate the system which attribute will be populated, in this case, looking for. And in the second line, you will see in the next slides, we will select the specific values that we need to select. In this case, again, it's a multi-select combo attribute, and you can specify more than one value. So in this case, I will show you how we'll need to map these attributes. So if you remember, this is similar to the payment instructions, where we have two lines. The first one to indicate the detail ID, and the next one that the value that will need to be populated. So for attributes, it's basically the same. For the first line, we need to specify which is the attribute ID. In this case, it's PM director. And in the second line, we will have the value and the value that we need to populate. And you can also import multiple attributes at the same time. So in this case, I'm mapping the first attribute, which is just a text attribute, and the second attribute, which is a multi-select combo attribute. And in this case, we will populate multiple values for this item, for this customer, sorry. Okay. So here's how the import scenario mapping looks like. Okay. For the multi-select combo attributes, you need to select multiple attributes. If you need to select multiple, they need to include these values in the same column, but just separated by commas. So in this case, I will look to populate attribute hardware and software. So you can see here, there's a comma in between them, and you can have as many as you want. I mean, in this example, I will populate 2, but you can have a multi-select combo attribute with like 10 values, and you can populate all of them or just the ones that you need. Just remember that you will need to enter a comma in between the attributes, okay? Okay, so here is the result, how the customer has the first attribute populated, and then the second, which is a multi-combo attribute, both values are selected, hardware and software. You can, if we go to the previous slide, you can see I don't have the actual description, which is the one that appears here. Remember, I used the attribute ID. I will go back to the previous slide, so you can see here, it's the attribute ID, the one that I'm using. Okay? And now I will also pull my Acumatica instance, and we will review this. for the import scenario. Which is customer attributes. Okay, so here we have the attributes. I will open attribute screen in a different tab. So I'm using two attributes, PM director and looking. Okay, so if we look for these ones, okay, so this is a simple text attribute, so this is pretty straightforward. You just need to map the attribute, and then under value column, we will have the actual text that we will populate. I will show you here on the prepared grid how it appears. Okay. This one is processed. I will process. Okay. So here is the text that will be populated under the attribute for this customer. And these are the two values separated by a comma. These are the multiple values that we will use to populate. Okay. So if we go to the customer screen, and select this customer, under attributes tab, you will see this is a text attribute, so anything that we have for the first value in here will be populated into this field. And here, if you have two attributes separated by a comma, which are hardware and software, the system will do this. Select hardware and software. Okay, so you can populate as many attributes as you need, just as long as they are separated by a comma. And remember, I did not use the attribute description. You need to use the actual attribute ID. Let me pull the attribute which is looking. Here's my, as you can see, it's a multi-select combo, and you can have as many values here. And we're using the value ID for hardware HW, for software SW. Okay, so this is the field, this is the values that we need to specify in our data provider, and the ones that need to be separated by commas. Okay, so if we go back to the prepared grid, you can see here my customer and my two attributes that I need to populate. I click on import. Okay, so the record is processed. So if we refresh the screen, and go to the attributes tab, you will see the values are populated with the project director, which in this case is John Doe. And the looking for, we have the two values specified, hardware and software. Let's say we need to update this, and we need to also select support with the input scenario. Okay, so for support, the value ID is SP. So I will, for testing purposes, I will populate this manually, but you can do it by uploading a new file once you have all the values that you need to specify. So again, the new one that we will populate is support SP. So if we separate this by a comma and enter SP, okay, and import the scenario, processed. You will see when we refresh, we will also have support here selected. So we'll go to Attributes tab, and now we have hardware, software, and support. Okay. And any questions regarding importing attributes? Any comments? Everything is fine. Okay. So, well, this was the last example. I hope all these commonly used scenarios are very useful for you, and this presentation will be, it's being recorded, so it will be also updated. If one of your colleagues or someone else that you want to share it, we will be happy if you can share it, and this will be updated into the partner portal. I will let you know, and you can review this. Also, I will try to update these scenarios files into this course, and you will be able to download these materials. I will update them as XML files, and you will be able to download them and test them. This work was performed in the sales demo, which most of you should already have. So this is basically the end. I will stop the recording. Let me know if you have any question. We have just some minutes to any comment that you have. If I have a quick answer, I can answer it right now. And if I don't have a specific answer, I need to search for it, I will email it to you. So let me know. Speak now, or I hope you enjoyed it. Also, I will thank you again. This was my first webinar, and I will be glad that in the future I will be presenting other ones. So again, thank you all for joining. I hope it's been useful for you. These are tips and tricks that you can use for other screens, but this is like the first things that you need to know, and some tricks that will help you to update to create your import scenarios and achieve what you need. Okay. Thank you all for attending the webinar. As I mentioned, this was recorded and it will be updated to our instance. Okay. Thank you for joining and have a great day.